At 2300 hours on November 14, 1942, the plot room aboard USS Washington watched a silent drama unfold on the green sweep of its SG radar screens. 9 Japanese ships, completely invisible to the naked eye on the dark waters north of Guadalcanal, appeared as sharp electronic echoes. Every revolution of the antenna updated their exact bearing and distance, while the Japanese searched by eye and by spotlight, unaware that an American battleship tracked their every move. Washington's crew relied on a revolutionary technology they had spent more than a year mastering. Its SG surface search radar and Mark III fire control radar allowed the ship to see and fight in conditions where human eyes were useless. The men had drilled endlessly, learning to hit targets at long distances, in pitch darkness, using nothing but radar data. Now they were moments away from proving just how powerful that advantage could be. Yet in 1942, few in the U.S. Navy believed battleships still had a meaningful role in modern war. Official doctrine insisted that aircraft carriers were the decisive weapons of the Pacific, and battleships existed only to protect them. Since Pearl Harbor, America's fast battleships had remained tied to carrier task forces, serving mainly as floating anti-aircraft platforms. Despite her size and firepower, Washington, built to engage enemy ships, had never fired her main battery in combat. That belief, that battleships were obsolete, had cost lives only 3 nights earlier. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan had led a cruiser-destroyer force into Iron Bottom Sound to stop a Japanese bombardment group. Callahan lacked the 2 U.S. battleships in theater, Washington and South Dakota, because they had been held back to shield the damaged carrier Enterprise. The result was a chaotic night battle in which American ships opened fire at point-blank range, often unable to distinguish friend from foe. Searchlights and star shells turned the darkness into a blinding haze. The destroyers Cushing, Laffey, Barton, and Monson were sunk. The cruisers Atlanta and Juno were lost, and both Admirals Callahan and Norman Scott were killed. More than 700 Americans died. The Japanese, though damaged, withdrew largely intact. From Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the reports with increasing alarm. The U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal were holding by inches. Henderson Field, the airstrip that made the island strategically vital, was facing near-constant bombardment. Now intelligence warned that another Japanese task force was closing in, a force under Admiral Nobutake Kondo, centered on the battlecruiser Kirishima, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. They intended to flatten Henderson Field and escort 11,000 fresh Japanese troops to the island. If successful, Guadalcanal would fall, and the months-long American campaign would collapse. Doctrine said battleships should never go into night combat without carrier protection. But the carrier Enterprise was limping with a patched flight deck and depleted air group. Nimitz faced a near impossible decision: keep the battleships near the carrier and risk losing Guadalcanal, or send them in alone and risk losing the ships. Despite every rule and every War College scenario warning against it, he ordered Admiral William Halsey to release the battleships for independent action. They would enter Iron Bottom Sound alone, at night, and fight the Japanese surface fleet head-on. The officer chosen to lead this desperate mission, Rear Admiral Willis A. Ching Lee, did not look like a warrior. Short, rumpled, bespectacled, and soft-spoken with a Kentucky drawl, he seemed more like a teacher than a naval combat commander. But Lee was a genius at gunnery and one of the finest marksmen the Navy had ever produced, with multiple Olympic shooting medals to his name. More importantly, he grasped the significance of radar at a time when most senior officers treated it as a novelty. To Lee, radar was not merely a detection tool, it was a revolutionary method of fighting. It allowed a ship to track targets through darkness and smoke, compute firing solutions with precision, and dominate an enemy unable to see.
For months, he had drilled his crews in radar-directed gunnery,
streamlining procedures and cutting out needless intermediaries. Radar operators communicated directly with gun directors. Fire control radars monitored the fall of shells in real time, and targeting adjustments could be made between salvos. None of this had been tested in combat, but Lee trusted his training. Task Force 64, Lee's improvised command, consisted of Washington, South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. Though formidable on paper, the reality was far less reassuring. The force had never operated together. South Dakota carried a green crew still working through earlier battle damage. The destroyers were drawn from different units, and Washington and South Dakota couldn't even communicate reliably because their radio systems were incompatible. Lee improvised a signaling plan with lights and predetermined maneuvers, the only way to coordinate his ships. The destroyers, lightly armored and armed with 5-inch guns, would bear the brunt of close combat. Their torpedoes were deadly, but required closing to under 10,000 yards, well within the reach of Japanese guns. The enemy, meanwhile, had spent 2 decades perfecting night-fighting tactics and possessed the devastating Type 93 long lance torpedo, capable of striking from miles away with enormous explosive power. As darkness fell on November 14th, Lee led his force around the western tip of Guadalcanal in a single column, destroyers in front, then Washington, then South Dakota. They passed the wreckage from Callahan's battle, oil slicks, debris, even bodies still drifting. Every sailor understood the stakes. Washington's radar operators detected Kondo's advanced destroyers at 18,000 yards. Lee faced a crucial choice: fire at long range and risk alerting the Japanese, or hold fire and let them draw nearer, trapping them in an ambush. Knowing the Japanese expected aircraft, not battleships, he chose to wait. The range fell to 16,000 yards, 14,000, 10,000. Still, the Japanese saw nothing. At 2300 hours, Lee gave the order to fire. 9 16-inch guns roared from Washington. Though the first salvo narrowly missed the light cruiser Sendai, the next targeted the destroyer Ayanami, scoring devastating hits that left her burning and dead in the water. The night erupted with star shells, searchlights, tracer fire, and explosions. But unlike 3 nights earlier, the Americans were not blind. Washington's radar tracked targets through the chaos. Then disaster struck. At 2337, South Dakota suffered a complete electrical failure. Her radar, guns, radios, everything went dark. Emergency generators restored partial power, but she could not fight effectively. Japanese spotlights illuminated her, and soon Kirishima and the heavy cruisers hammered her with 14-inch and 8-inch shells. Superstructure shredded, communications destroyed, dozens dead and wounded. South Dakota was forced out of the battle. The American destroyers fought desperately, but were overwhelmed. Preston exploded and sank. Walk was blasted apart by gunfire